Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Faculty of Law at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Thank you all very much for coming along today to this, the latest seminar in our Greater China Legal History seminar series. Today's seminar is given by Professor Norman Ho. Professor Ho is Associate Professor of Law at the Peking Transnational University of Law in Shenzhen. Professor Ho, the distinguished practice and research background, served as a visiting fellow at the Asian Law Institute at the National University of Singapore and the Centre for Chinese Law at the University of Hong Kong. And before he went into academia, Professor Ho practiced in the Hong Kong offices of Morrison, Foster and Slaughter and May. Professor Ho today will be talking about Confucianism and Chinese law.
Okay, thank you very much for that generous introduction, Dean Gallagher. I would also like to thank Dean Wolf and also Ms. Gina Yu for all of their help in organizing and having me here to give this seminar. I especially would like to thank all of you also for coming during lunchtime. Lunchtime is important for everybody, but for practitioners in the audience, I know lunchtime is almost sacrosanct. You're only hour and a half to 2 hours to relax during a day. So I appreciate also those practitioners who are here today. I'm going to speak today on Confucianism in Chinese law, past and present, and essentially discuss Confucian legal thought with an emphasis on the thinkings of Confucius and Mencius, the two earliest and most important Confucian philosophers. This topic, of course, is extremely broad, and we could not do justice to it in about an hour. So, and Confucianism is such a broad tradition with various thinkers. So my talk today will mainly focus on the legal thought of Confucius and Mencius, but also I would like to take you through later dynasties to see how Confucianism impacted Chinese law. We will look at the Han and Tang dynasties. And then I'll conclude with some observations of what I think are Confucianism's impact or influence on modern Chinese law today. So I think it's well known that there is a revival of Confucianism both on the state and private level in mainland China today, which is of course a huge about face, right? If you just look at these photos, on the left you have a statue of Confucius during the Cultural Revolution approximately 50 years ago, with the sign in Chinese there, Confucius, number one bastard, and here the statue being defaced. And then about 50 years later, an about face where you have another Confucius statue in pristine condition and ceremonies being held, many of which are encouraged and sponsored by the government to honor Confucius's memory. And I think this phenomenon is well known. You also see it happening on the international stage with the establishment of Confucius institutes all around the world, which have been in some sense controversial in some quarters, but it is a sign also of Confucius's revival in modern times. I think what has been less discussed, however, is Confucianism's revival in the legal sphere. And Chinese officials from the highest echelons of the Chinese leadership have emphasized the importance of traditional Chinese legal culture in modern China's rule of law development and reform program. And because Confucianism was the predominant philosophy in traditional Chinese culture, basically what these officials have been saying is Confucian legal culture still matters today for China. So just to give you some examples of this, Zhou Qiang, the president and head of the Supreme People's Court of China, has publicly urged people to remember traditional Chinese culture. This is from an article where he says, study traditional Chinese legal culture, promote an impartial judiciary. So there's an idea that China today, we don't need to learn necessarily everything from the West. We have a diverse and very rich legal tradition ourselves, which can serve as a resource for reforming our legal system. President Xi Jinping has also said on numerous occasions, emphasizing the importance of traditional Chinese law. This is a passage from a speech he gave on building socialist rule of law in China. He says, the legal system of ancient China embodied a huge wealth of knowledge and wisdom, allowing it to occupy a unique place among the major legal systems of the world. we need to take note of the successes and failures of China's ancient legal traditions, identify, extract, and promote the very finest elements of China's traditional legal culture, and selectively integrate these elements into our present initiatives, right? So it couldn't be clearer, right? Among the Chinese leadership, there is a desire to push traditional Chinese legal culture, not only on its own terms, but also as a valuable resource for reforming the legal system today. Now, so what is Confucian legal culture? What is Confucian legal thought? And as I mentioned, I'm going to be focusing primarily on the thought of Confucius and Mencius, the two earliest and most important Confucian philosophers. Right? So Confucius and Mencius both lived in times of turmoil, right, in ancient China, where the center of power, traditionally, the Zhou court, had split, and essentially hegemons were controlling different parts of China. And Confucius was extremely bothered by what he saw, right? The world was in chaos, rulers were fighting each other, violence and corruption were widespread. And so his basic starting point was, how can we make the world and make society better? And more specifically, how can we get back to the glory days of the early Zhou dynasty, when in his view everything was peaceful and people were morally correct? Right now, if you think about it, if you are a king and you have a country that you've started, and your goal is to create a morally correct society where people behave themselves, subjects are loyal to one another and to the leadership, what are your options, right? Well, of course, as king, you might pass many laws and harsh punishments to scare the people into submission, right? And you could organize a society that way, right? And it might work. Or you could say, well, I don't want to go that route because I don't want people to just fear me. So I'm going to set a good moral example. I'm going to be a good person. And hopefully that will be infectious, right? People are also going to follow my lead. And we're going to emphasize education and cultivation. And so people learn how to be morally good people, right? And so we're not going to emphasize the law and punishment bit, right? Or of course, one third option is you have a combination, right? On one hand, you emphasize virtue and morality through personal self-cultivation, right? And you also have laws and punishments to back them up, right? So what was Confucius's answer to how do we make society better? How do we get on the right path again, right? So before we get into the law stuff, right, it's important to understand that Confucius, for him, the answer did not lie primarily in law and punishments, right? That was not the main and most important norm for improving society. For Confucius, right, the main norm, right, the answer lied in ritual or ritual propriety, in Mandarin, li, right, the concept of li. And this concept of li, or ritual propriety, in ancient China, the definition of li, or ritual propriety, was quite narrow. It referred generally to funeral rites specifically, right? The proper ritual or actions you would take when somebody passes away, both at the funeral and also after the funeral when you are mourning for that person. Confucius broadens the definition of ritual propriety, li, to not only include funeral rites, but also any type of morally correct, ethical, or civilized behavior. Okay? And Confucius's li, or ritual propriety, is the key for helping bring back society on our own. Because ritual propriety can, number one, it can help regulate human behavior, right? It can help people to avoid doing bad things, but it can also teach people how to behave, right? In that sense, it is better than law. So that's quite abstract. Let me give an example. And one thing I would challenge all of you to think about is this idea of ritual may be quite foreign and abstract, but just think about in our daily lives today in 2018, how many rituals you go through during your day. Right? When you wake up in the morning, you probably see your loved one or your family and friends, and what's a ritual you go through? You probably say, oh, good morning, honey. Good morning, sweetie. Good morning, dear. And the kids get ready for school. Good morning, daddy. Good morning, mommy. Right? For Confucius, that's an example of a ritual, right? Proper, morally correct behavior. No one is holding a gun to the children's head saying, okay, you have to say good morning to your dad, otherwise you're going to be locked up and grounded in your room for 5 months, right? No one is also forcing the husband necessarily to say good morning to his wife, right? That's an example of a ritual where you act in a certain way, and you also get others to act in a certain way, right? So when, for example, when the father says good morning to his children, they will respond, oh, good morning. And the father has done this not through force, not through fear, not through putting the fear of punishment in the child's head, but he gets the child to respond in a certain way, right, through his own actions, right? If we take a more serious event on a larger scale, think about university graduations or commencements, right? Since we're in a university setting now, that would be a great example of ritual, right? So if you think about the university commencement, it's a ritual on a huge scale. People dress up, right? Students will wear their academic garb, faculty wear theirs, parents and friends who come also get dressed up. It's a big occasion. And when the music starts, right, usually I suppose it would be Elgar's Pomp and Circumstance. I think that's the one people play all the time. And people march into the auditorium or venue. Sometimes you can feel the electricity in the room, right? The pride people feel. Right? And then as you see people walk in, as you see students receive their diplomas, people naturally feel feelings of gratitude, right? Their families are there. They may thank their parents for their support. They may thank their faculty for their support. The teachers are happy to see the students succeed, right? And you bring to graduation that kind of proper attitude, right? And it's not because anybody held a gun to your head and said, okay, now it's graduation time. You have to walk in, and I want you to feel gratitude. I want you to feel happiness you're graduating. No, it's the ritual of graduation which produces these feelings within you and also cause you to act in certain ways, right? Whether it be thanking your professor when you see him at graduation or hugging your parents after you receive your diploma. This is the power of ritual, right, for Confucius. And this is the answer, right, how we can get back on the proper path, okay? And of course, Confucianism especially emphasizes the virtue of filial piety, or devotion to one's parents. As a Confucian virtue, filial piety is so important because it is also rooted in a ritual propriety as well. If you think about ritual, of course, doesn't come out of anywhere, right? Confucius says we have to use education, right? You have to be educated on what the proper rituals are, or you see people act in a certain way, an exemplar, a model, and then you learn from them, right? So if you think about in our lives, who are the first people we learn from? Our parents, right? Who are the first people who teach us, or who are supposed to teach us love and other virtues and understanding of and tolerance? It's our parents, right? So Confucianism especially emphasizes filial piety, not just because it's they think naturally people should be closer to their parents, but it's your parents, that parent-child relationship, which really grounds you in an educational and self-cultivation program to developing ritual propriety and your understanding of ritual propriety. Okay, so far I've spoken mainly on the personal level, how Confucius thinks we can become better, right? What about at the government level? Well, similarly, in a nutshell, Confucian legal thought, as seen through the thought of Confucius, does not emphasize law and punishments as the primary norm, right? So let me just go through a couple of famous passages from the Analects, or in Mandarin, 论语, right, of Confucius, where we can see some of Confucius's legal thought. So for government, right, Confucius emphasized what is the ideal way that we should make government good, right? He introduces a concept called the rectification of names, or 正名 in Mandarin. And this is a very famous passage where a duke of the state of Qi in ancient China, Duke Jing of Qi, asked Confucius about governing. How can we govern effectively? And Confucius responded in a very brief sentence, let the Lord be a true Lord, let ministers be true ministers, the fathers true fathers, and the sons true sons, right? And basically Confucius's point is, all of us have roles and natural hierarchies in society, right? That are defined and set forth by ritual propriety. And so to make government good, right, the main emphasis should not be on law and punishments, but just getting people to act correctly according to their place in society and according to ritual propriety. So, in other words, let the Lord be a true Lord, meaning as a ruler, he should be a good ruler who cares about the people, and the ministers should be loyal fathers, true fathers, and the sons, true sons. In other words, all of us have a role and name and label in society. Teacher, student, lawyer, right? And Confucius's point is each name contains certain moral expectations people have on you, certain ritual expectations people have of you. And so the goal is just fulfilling your name, right? I should just emphasize this is not a uniquely Chinese concept, right? If you think about, I think some of you may have seen, Western movies, when a parent is a bad parent, right, and the child rebels and says, "You didn't love me at all, Daddy. You don't deserve to be called a father," right? That is an example of rectification of names in a modern sort of movie setting. Okay. Another famous passage from the Analects is this one. Confucius says, if you try to guide the common people with coercive regulations and keep them in line with punishments, the common people will become evasive and will have no sense of shame. If, however, you guide them with virtue and keep them in line by means of ritual, li, right, the people will have a sense of shame and will rectify themselves. So law and punishments should not be the primary norms for governing society and people. People should be led by means of virtue and ritual, right? And Confucius makes the point, if you lead people by laws and punishments, obviously that will create fear, but more importantly, people will just try to avoid certain behavior, right? They will plan their affairs in such a way where, I'll do something, but I just don't want to break the law, right? Whereas if you treat people lead them by means of virtue and ritual, that's more effective because they're going to be doing things, they're actually going to be affirmatively doing good moral actions, right? And they'll have a sense of shame and rectify themselves. Here, I have on the slide here, expressing horror at the publicization of laws. So I just wanted to convey an interesting story here. If you think about modern rule of law system, right, making laws public and available for people to read is a hallmark, right, of a modern rule of law system. Confucius, however, interestingly expressed horror at laws being published and available for ordinary people to read. And there's a famous story from the 6th century, 6th century BC, right? The ancient Chinese state of Jin published, or I should say not published, carved their laws, their code, on a cauldron, right? The idea was, of course, people could see it. Confucius was horrified at this. He denounced the state of Jin, saying dramatically, Jin is going to die. The state is going to collapse, right? Because why? The laws are there, and now everybody in the state of Jin are going to, quote, he says, attend to the cauldron, unquote. Right? Basically, they're going to behave and manage their behavior only with what the cauldron says, right? And they're not going to act morally, right? And they're not going to respect the proper order or hierarchy, right? So what's the ideal for Confucius, right? The ideal is essentially law becomes a very low norm in society. Again, and we lead people by means of virtue and ritual. This is another famous passage, right, where Confucius says, when it comes to hearing civil litigation, I am as good as anyone else. What is necessary, though, is to bring it about that there is no civil litigation at all. So this is an ideal world for Confucius, where lawsuits end, right? Now, interestingly, though, Confucius is quite confident, and people often forget Confucius in his public life. Right? He did serve as an official for some time. He served in a judicial capacity, right? And he oversaw some cases, and so he confidently said, if I have to hear cases in a judicial capacity, I'm good at it. I can do it. Yeah. But ideally, I don't want to hear any of these cases, right? I have here the confident Confucius, right? And what does that mean? So what was Confucius's ideal? We can also see this reflected in his autobiography. There's actually a passage in the Analects which is autobiographical, right? And Confucius said, and some of you may know this passage, it's very famous as well. Confucius says, okay, let me tell you about my life. At 15, I set my mind on learning. At 30, I stood firm. Right? At 40 years of age, I had no doubts. At 50, I could know the orders and decrees of heaven. At 60, my ear was attuned to the truth, right? It would hear the truth. And this is the best one. At 70, I could follow what my heart desired without transgressing what was right, right? And so this is the ideal. And law and punishments can't lead us there, but ritual and virtue can. The ideal is at the age of 70, right? Confucius basically says, I know what's right. It's become eternalized. It's become ingrained in my DNA. So I can spontaneously make moral decisions, right, myself, right? So perhaps this may be a goal for many of us as well. And what happens when law and family obligations conflict, or law and ritual propriety conflict, right? And Confucius was quite clear, when these things conflict, law, because it's a lower norm in society, right, family obligations and the ritual of family should win out. So there's another famous passage here in the Analects, just wanted to share with everyone. The Duke of Shi said to Confucius, among my people there is one who we call upright Gong, right, this upright moral person. And when his father stole a sheep, he reported his father to the authorities. Okay? And Confucius replied, well, among my people, we're different. Those who we consider upright are different from upright Gong. Fathers cover up for their sons, and sons cover up for their fathers. Uprightness is to be found in this. Right? So again, a clear passage showing, in Confucius' view, when family obligations and law conflict, you have your legal obligation, perhaps of reporting a crime, is below your moral obligation towards your father. Right? Okay, moving on now to Mencius, right? About 2 generations so after Confucius, right? Who develops Confucius's thought, right? Mencius basically carries forth many of Confucius's teachings, although he clarifies some and develops some. Obviously, we don't have time to go through all of the details of his philosophy. I'll just focus on a couple, right? Mencius is perhaps most famous in Chinese philosophy for his views on human nature, right? And so Mencius argues that human nature is good, right? We have the innate knowledge of good, and to prove this, he does a thought experiment, which some of you may know. It's called the child in well experiment. He says, if somebody sees a child about to fall into the well, that person will feel feelings of, urgency or sadness, right? And it'll be spontaneous, right? He's not feeling those things because he wants to look good in front of other people. It's just a natural type of feeling. And he uses this as a proof, right, that humans by nature are good. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you see the child falling into the well, that you will run after the child and dive into the well yourself. But the emphasis is that pang, that sudden feeling that you have that's almost spontaneous. As an aside, if any of you are interested in this, there actually are people on YouTube who have empirically tested this. They're YouTube pranksters, some of you may know. Now, the YouTube pranksters, I don't think they know anything about Mencius, right? But there's one video I show to my students sometimes, which is they prank. They have like a baby doll in a baby carriage, and they push the baby carriage towards a pond. And the idea is to see how people in the park react. And if you watch it, it's very interesting. Some people just go, right, oh, right, which is again that pang. Others you see, oh my gosh, running after the baby. And the interesting thing is nobody, at least who was caught on camera, nobody was like, ha ha ha, baby's going into the pond, or there was nobody. Everyone had some sort of reaction, and sad reaction at that. Okay, and so human nature is good, and so Mencius argues we have the innate knowledge within us of what is good, right? And evil is not something inborn to us. Where does evil come from? It comes from, Mencius says, a variety of things. It may be our own temptations. It may be external influences. We're raised in a bad environment. But at the fundamental level, Mencius argues that we are good people, and therefore anybody has the capacity to reform themselves and become not only good, but to become a sage. Right? And implications on Chinese legal thought, one thing you might see in modern Chinese law today is, of course, there's a huge emphasis on people confessing their crimes and displaying good attitude. So sometimes if you read news coverage of Chinese cases, right, the media will sometimes point out if a criminal showed good attitude during sentencing. Did he admit his crime? Did he admit that, oh, I was really bad and I want to be better, right? And so sometimes in Chinese interrogations rooms, you see the famous slogan here, right? Leniency for those who confess, right? Severity for those who resist, right? And the idea is people who confess, we should, generally speaking, be better to them. There's still something good there that we can perhaps recover, right? Now, in terms of Mencius' specific views on law, they're not much different than Confucius. For him, law is a lower norm in society, and again, ritual and virtue should govern. Rather than, I thought one thing I would do is just show you all a story, actually, from the Mencius, which I think nicely encapsulates his legal thought in just one story. So I'm sorry, there's a lot of text here, but it's just the story. I wanted to show you the original source, okay? So this is the story from the Mencius, okay? And so Tao Ying asked Mencius, saying, Shun, and Shun is a famous sage king in Chinese history who's held up as a model for all later dynasties, right? A wonderful moral king. So Tao Ying asks Mencius, Shun, being king or being sovereign, and Gao Yao, his chief minister of justice, right? If Gu So, who is Shun's father, and he was blind, if Shun's father had murdered a man, what would have been done in this case, right? And Mencius said, well, Gao Yao would simply have apprehended him or arrested him. And Tao Ying said, but would not Shun have forbidden such a thing? So would Shun not have actually interfered with the arrest? Because after all, it's his own father. And Mencius replies, indeed, how could Shun have forbidden it? Gao Yao had received the law from a proper source. Gao Yao was simply carrying out his duties in accordance to law. Tao Ying said, in that case, what would Shun have done? And Mencius replied, you know what? He would have done this. Shun would have regarded abandoning the kingdom as throwing away a worn-out sandal. He would privately have taken his father on his back and retired into concealment, living somewhere along the seacoast. There he would have been all his life, cheerful and happy, forgetting the kingdom. Now you can see similarities with the Confucius' point, remember, about fathers covering for their sons, sons covering for their fathers, and that's upright. Here, when law and family obligations conflict, Mencius also believes, right, that Shun has a greater duty to his father, that he should help his father escape. But notice, it would be wrong, I think, to interpret this passage as Mencius and Confucianism do not care about law, right? What this passage shows us is still that Mencius believes law should be applied fairly, right? Doesn't matter if you are the father of the king. Legal officers should have some degree, so Gao Yao, legal officers should have some degree of independence to uphold and carry out and implement the law. Emperors ideally should not interfere with the process, but again, the obligations to his father are greater. But what do you notice happens here? Shun, he sacrifices something, right? He sacrifices his position as emperor, right? Which suggests Mencius' belief that, again, you, of course, owe a duty to your father. You don't want him to get arrested, but you shouldn't stay as emperor because what you've done is you've essentially gone against the law. Okay. Now, the Confucians, they face some challenges from the legalists or the fajia, right? Examples of which are Hanfei and Shangyang. And I don't want to spend too much time on the legalists, but they're essentially another group of philosophers who say, the Confucian vision and proposal for making things better is wrong, right? This idea of virtue as the primary norm, ritual propriety, honoring the natural hierarchies in society, right? That is not going to be good for society. And the legalists basically say to make a strong state, what we need is a very comprehensive public legal code, clear laws, right? Law and punishment should be really a higher norm, right? We should punish, for example, lesser offenses more severely, actually, right? Because if you punish someone for a lesser offense more seriously, they'll never commit that crime again, and they'll be afraid of committing even more serious crimes. Reporting, good. In fact, some legalist philosophers said, if you report on your neighbor or if you report on your parents if they committed a crime, that kind of activity should be honored and rewarded. Okay, and in fact, Shang Yang proposed, if somebody helps another person cover up the crime. So, for example, if a son helps cover up his father's crime and they're caught, the son will suffer the same penalty as if he committed his father's crime. Right? So, a completely different vision than Confucius and Mencius, really. Now, the legalists, they get their day, but only for about 20 years. They establish the first imperial dynasty of China, the Qing dynasty, right? And they try to set forth the legalist program. The Qing dynasty, as many of you may know, does not last long at all. It falls within just about 2 decades. Of course, that is used by later Confucians as empirical proof that legalism is terrible, right? Because if legalism was truly good, the Qing dynasty would have lasted for 400 or 500 years. But legalism continues on, even though many Confucians did not like to admit it. So in the next dynasty, the Han dynasty, which is famous in Chinese philosophy because Confucianism is selected by the emperor as the orthodox philosophy of the state and society, the Han emperors basically, in many respects, keep the Qing legal code, right, the legalist legal code, but they just change it, right, which scholars have referred to as a process of they Confucianize the law. So they keep the legal code, but then they change it so that the legal code transmits and reinforces Confucian values. Okay? And this starts a process which is called, oftentimes by scholars, as the Confucianization of law, okay? Which starts in the Han dynasty and reaches its completion in the Tang dynasty. One of the best examples of how far the Confucians were willing to go is in the practice called, in English, using the spring and autumn annals to decide legal cases. In Mandarin, 春秋决议. Now, you need to know some background information about the spring and autumn annals. It was a Confucian classic text, right, which was traditionally believed to have been written by Confucius. So it basically won canonical status in Chinese history. And it was believed that the spring and autumn annals, which was an annalistic history of the ancient Chinese state of Lu in ancient China, that this history contained important moral and political lessons. So what did some Confucians in the Han dynasty propose? They said, we have the statutes and the law here, but we also have Confucian texts here. We should be using the Confucian texts, actually, to help decide legal cases. In other words, we should not be using the law primarily, and if they conflict, we should follow the spring and autumn annals, right? This is an example of almost extreme Confucianization of law, where legal statutes are set aside and a Confucian text honored. Let me just give you one quick example. There are many examples of this, but let me just give you one example of an actual case. Now, this case happened in about 60 to 70 AD, and it involved a minister, an official named Wang. He was a local official, and he was a regional inspector. So his job was going through a province to inspect the situation on the ground and make reports to the emperor, essentially. Now, in the place he was inspecting, there was a big drought, and people were suffering in the streets. According to the historical record, it says that Wang saw hungry and naked people crying in the streets, starving, asking for food. Now, he was extremely disturbed and saddened by this, and so he ordered that millet and cloth be distributed to these suffering people. And after he ordered and distributed the millet and cloth, only then did he inform the emperor of his decision. Now, under Han law, this was a violation because officials had to first inform the emperor of their proposal and then receive authorization before they could actually distribute the millet and cloth. And so the emperor at that time, Emperor Ming, was extremely upset, and he said, I want to punish Wang for his insubordinate behavior. So one group of officials said, yeah, punish him, because again, he broke the law. He committed the crime of, quote, giving orders without authorization. Giving orders meaning Wang was giving orders to distribute the millet and cloth without authorization. However, there were a group of officials who dissented. They said, yeah, I mean, technically speaking, he did break the law. But look at the spring and autumn annals. Look at the spring and autumn annals. And so this is the one opinion from a dissenting official. I put it here. And the official says, in antiquity, as recorded by the spring and autumn annals, Huang Yuan and Zifan, two good ministers from the state of Song and Chu, did not follow their commands of the lords and, acting on their personal discretion, brought peace to their two states. Now you might be wondering who these two folks are. They were officials in ancient China, and essentially the states of Song and Chu were at war, and the rulers were fighting with each other. Now these two officials, one from Song, one from Chu, again, technically they're enemies, right? They're fighting. But they agree to a parley, and they meet to discuss things. And essentially Huang Yuan told Zifan, you know, we are in a very difficult position. The people of Song are suffering in this war. And so basically the two of them agreed, let's negotiate a peace. Even in violation of orders from the king, their kings, let's negotiate a peace. And let's stop this senseless war, right? Let's pursue compassion, right? And eventually the war was ended and there was peace. And actually Confucius also praised their action. He said, these two guys are good ministers. They have the bigger picture in mind. And it was actually one of the only few military actions that Confucius praised, which is their military parley. Okay, so the official cites to that, and then he says, it is a principle of the spring and autumn annals to consider one's virtues when discussing such cases. Right? So you can see the reasoning of the official. He cites a specific event as recorded in the spring and autumn annals, the Trinqiu, right, and analogizes, reasons by analogy with Wang. He also tries to derive a principle, or what we might call rule of law, right, or principle from the spring and autumn annals, right, from this case. We have to consider one's virtue when discussing such cases. Now, with his thoughts on righteousness, Wang forgot his crime, and faced with an opportunity to practice humaneness, he did not yield. If you were to correct him by means of the law, you would ignore his original sentiments and thwart the sagely court's precept of loving and nurturing the people. And so what happened at the end? The emperor pardoned Wang from punishment, and he was allowed to go. So this is an example, right, where a Confucian text basically has the status of law and is in fact higher, right, than legal norms and the statute in this case. Now, the Confucianization of law reaches its apex. Most scholars consider it reaches its apex in the Tang dynasty with the Tang Code, an accomplishment of Chinese legal history. It's the earliest and most complete penal code we still have in existence today. And essentially, the Tang Code uses the legalist model of a penal code, but Confucianized it, which means it imbued the legal code with Confucian values. Okay. So this is just some examples in the Tang Code of how it Confucianized legal statutes. So just as an example, social and political status affected the punishment one might receive. Family members were allowed to conceal for each other. Offenses by superiors against inferiors should be punished less heavily. The reason I wanted to discuss this is because you remember Confucius said it's good for fathers to cover up for their sons, sons to cover up their fathers. And then you remember Mencius, right? The story of Tao Ying, Shun, and Shun's father. And Mencius said Shun should carry his father and escape, essentially cover up his father's crime. Well, finally, we have in the Tang Code, surviving today, the article, right, in law, right? So you can see Article 46.1 of the Tang Code says, all cases involving those who dwell together or relatives of the third or closer degree of mourning, including maternal grandparents, grandsons in the female line, the wives of grandchildren in the male line, and the husband's brothers and their wives, allow mutual concealment. Allow mutual concealment should one of them commit a crime. So there you have it, right? A Confucianization of law where the attitude of Confucius and Mencius about the importance of ritual propriety and filial piety in allowing people to cover up for their father's crimes, that is now put into the law in the Tang Code. Right? Another thing that you can see the impact of Confucianism on the Tang Code is through the section of the Tang Code known as the 10 Abominations. And these were 10 crimes, and they were codified as the worst, most terrible crimes, and listed in a separate section of their own in the Tang Code. So just very briefly, here are the 10 abominations. Okay? Plotting rebellion, plotting great sedition, plotting rebellion, essentially endangering the ruler or the state, plotting great sedition, which is essentially plotting to destroy imperial temples, tombs, palaces, and so forth. Plotting treason, betraying the imperial house or imperial city, or helping rebels. Right? Now you notice the interesting thing is, what's the crime here? It's not committing rebellion, it's plotting rebellion. So the mere thought or planning of a rebellion, even if you say, oh, this is ridiculous, and you throw out your plans in the trash can, you've committed an abomination, right? Contumacy, which was essentially beating or plotting to kill your parents and other senior relatives. Depravity, which was defined as killing 3 members of a single household or keeping certain poisons. Great irreverence, which was defined as lacking the manners that you owe to an emperor, right? Or stealing an emperor's possessions. So there's a famous Chinese TV show that was, I don't know in Hong Kong if it's popular, but in mainland China it's been, which is the story of Yanxi Palace, Yanxi Gongdue in Chinese. And there are some scenes, I think, where great irreverence is at play, where these are in the Tang Code, but they basically passed on to later dynasties too, right? Where I think one of the main character, right, the main consort, she criticizes the emperor, right, and the eunuch next to her says, "Oh, you've committed great irreverence. You have to be careful," right? Lack of filial piety, discord, unrighteousness, and incest, right? And so you can see these crimes, if you use numbers to analyze it, right, 4 out of the 10 of these crimes deal with the emperor, right? Rebellion, sedition, treason, and great irreverence, showing the Confucian emphasis on natural order and hierarchy, right? 8 of them deal with some authority figure, some crime against an authority figure, right? So the 4 for the emperor, rebellion, sedition, treason, irreverence, and then filial piety, contumacy, that's against your parents, who are your authority figures. Unrighteousness, which includes certain crimes. The teachers in this room will like this one, because this covered the crime of killing one's teacher. Okay, so if you killed your teacher, it wasn't just ordinary homicide. You've actually committed an abomination. Okay. And indeed, in the Qing dynasty, there was a penalty for people who committed especially heinous abominations, such as killing your parents, right? Some of these were punished by the penalty of lingchu, which is slow slicing, right, where the executioner would slowly slice pieces off your body, right? There's a scene in the story of Yanxi Palace where the emperor is sentencing a eunuch to death by lingchu because he was plotting a rebellion. But in the end, he was spared. But lingchu is also an expression of the emphasis Confucianism places on family relationships and hierarchy. So the emphasis on today's seminar has been historical, but I do want to conclude with some remarks about Confucianism's impact on modern Chinese law. So if you think about the question, what is contemporary modern Chinese law anyway, right? It is basically an amalgam, right? It is an amalgam of traditional Chinese law or traditionally Chinese legal attitudes, Soviet law, right? Continental civil law, so influences from Germany and Japan, and common law systems. So, for example, American law, right? Especially in the areas of, say, securities law, where American law has been has had some influence, right? So traditional Chinese law still matters, right, if you frame modern Chinese law this way. And many of the debates that Confucians had with legalism about the place in law, right, continue today. So if you theorize Confucian legal thought as, one that considers law as a lower norm, and one which emphasizes more informal means of control through ritual and virtue versus more formal type control. So the legalists say, we have to have formal laws, formal punishments. These kind of debates have continued throughout China over the past century and onto today. So Mao, for example, Mao is an interesting ruler because for some parts of his reign, he seemed to favor what we might call a more Confucian approach, which is we don't want necessarily formal laws, right? But informality is something good, right? Ruling by example, by the authority of a king or a ruler is what we should do, right? And you could see this, for example, in the 1960s, right, when Mao wanted to smash judicial organs, right, in the Cultural Revolution. The emphasis was on rule of man then, right? And the famous People's Daily article in 1967 with the headline "In Praise of Lawlessness," right? And so Mao, he preferred this kind of flexibility, and law was a tool to promote certain political ends. On the other hand, Mao also, in some areas, he reformed the law and introduced comprehensive legal reform and legal codes, such as laws on marriage, trying to equalize treatment of women and men. Okay? In the 1970s, the party launched a more anti-Confucian and pro-legalist campaigns, praising legalism and the legalist model. Afterwards, Deng Xiaoping, he was horrified at the overemphasis on ideology in the Mao years, and so he turned to what has been called instrumental pragmatism, right, and emphasized the importance of law in building a socialism with Chinese characteristics, and law as a tool to legitimate and to improve the Chinese economy, right? And of course, his famous expression, it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches the mouse, it's a good cat, right? So we shouldn't be slaves to ideology, whether it be a white or a black cat. As long as it gets the job done, that's good, right? And then you see growing interest in Confucianism starting, I think, with the Jiang Zemin era, right, where he tries to promote Confucian culture, right? Hu Jintao's slogan of harmonious society, right, in Mandarin, 和谐社会, which has been analyzed by many modern commentators as also having Confucian undertones, right, up to the 2014 fourth plenary session in China, right, quote, "To realize the goals of ruling in accord with law, we must uphold the combination of ruling the nation in accord with the law and ruling it with virtue," right? So you can see here, it's a combination almost arguably of the legalist emphasis on law and the Confucian emphasis on rule of virtue. I wanted to show you this slide, which I think illustrates the continuity. So one of the points I wanted to make, hopefully in this talk, is there exists continuity with how the Chinese state has thought about law, both in Chinese history and up to the present day. I'm not arguing there's a causal relationship, right? But I do want to make the point that there is continuity in how law is thought about and what the purpose of law is. I think this slide really shows it well. So on the left, I have the preface to the Tang Code, which is from 653 AD. On the right, I have President Xi Jinping, his remarks in 2014. Now, I want us to read it together, and I think you guys will see, wait, it's really similar, right? So the Tang Code preface, 7th century, virtue and morals are the foundation of government and education, while laws and punishments are the operative agencies of government and education. The former and latter are necessary complements to each other, just as it takes morning and evening to form a whole day, or spring and autumn to form a full year. And this is Wallace Johnson's translation. So the idea is the Tang Code says, virtue, morals, or ritual propriety and laws, they must have each other, right? They're complementary, and they're required to be complementary, just like you need to have evening and day scientifically to have one full day. Now let's go to 2016. President Xi, law is a set of virtues in writing. Virtue represents the law in one's inner world. Both function to regulate people's conduct in social relations and maintain social order. Law ensures social stability while virtue nourishes the mind. And look at this quote. The rule of law and the rule of virtue are inseparable and must be balanced and coordinated for better national governance. So over 1,400 years apart, but you see continuity in how law is being thought about. Law and virtue are seen as inseparable, and that is a Confucian influence, right, from the Confucianization of law, which started in the Han Dynasty. Cases. I don't want to get, I'm not making the argument that judges in China are thinking about Confucius when they decide cases, because there's no evidence to prove that. But we could argue that Confucianism may play a role in adjudication, or at least attitudes towards adjudication. I don't have time to go through all of these three cases. Let me just go over one. This is a headline from the New York Times. Court in China reduces sentence for man who killed debt collector. Some of you may have followed this case. In 2016, 11 debt collectors went into I think it was a store owned by a mother, and her son helped her. They were extremely aggressive. One of the debt collectors cursed at the mother and exposed his genitals to her. Her son, who was 22 years old at the time, took a knife and stabbed some of the debt collectors to protect her. He killed one of them. The one who was killed was the one who had exposed his genitals. In 2017, this case came before the Shandong courts. He was sentenced to life in prison. He committed murder, right? However, the public was so outraged, right? And in June, a couple of months later, the Shandong higher court overruled the lower court, sentencing him only to 5 years. So that's a huge difference, right? And so commentators have pointed out that may be the continuing impact on filial piety in Chinese adjudication today. There are some other cases. If you're interested, we can talk about them in the Q&A, but that's one case I'll emphasize. So conclusions. In specific bullet points, what do I see as some of Confucianism's impact on law and legal institutions in China? One is Confucianism may be impacting the actual content of some legislation. So most famously, in 2013, the Elderly Protection Law was promulgated by the Chinese state, which included provisions such as children should care for their parents' spiritual needs, children should go home often to visit their parents. And this was in response to the phenomenon where children were moving out of their hometowns to work in the cities, and they weren't properly being devoted to their parents. Number two, Confucianism may still perhaps influence adjudication in some ways, such as the case we just discussed with the debt collectors. Confucianism, I think, continues to impact general social attitudes in China towards law in the hierarchy of norms. So there seems to be a cultural or social attitude that law may not be the primary norm in society or the most important norm in society. And I think you can see some of this in even the Chinese language itself, modern Chinese language. So this is just a simple example, but in modern Chinese, there's a expression, 规定是死，人是活的, in Mandarin, which is, the literal translation is regulations and rules are dead, but people are living. What it means is, regulations are too rigid, people are more flexible. And oftentimes you say this, I've heard this said, when someone is trying to get something done and the other party says, no, I'm sorry, I can't accept this document. You didn't follow the rules. The deadline, you missed the deadline, or you didn't fill out this section properly, so I can't accept this. And then the other person will say, oh, come on, regulations and rules are so rigid. I'm a living person. Can't you just be more open? Can't you accept this application? Think of the broader moral implications of your decision, right? And the broad visions on the concept and role of law, I think, is a continuity you can see, right? Which is, at least it seems in the mindset of the Chinese state, both past and present, law is understood quite narrowly, right? As and in a rather instrumentalist way, as tools for promoting certain virtues. Okay. So I think I'll stop there and open it up for question and answers or comments and discussions. And I've been asked just to let people know, if you'd like to ask a question, I think there will be mics provided. So if you could kindly wait for the mic to reach you, because this event is being recorded. So thank you all for coming. If you would like to discuss this further, feel free to contact me. I look forward to your questions.